Stop scratching up my paint with that old key, James, because it does not fit anymore. The metallic voice crackled through the doorbell speaker, and I dropped my hand from the brass doorknob. The metal felt like ice against my bare palm. A harsh, chemical smell of freshly cut brass lingered in the damp evening air, drifting from a small pile of metal shavings on the welcome mat. "Melissa," I said, leaning close to the camera lens. "Open the door. I need to get a flashlight. It is getting dark, and Duke is still out there." "That flea bag is gone," my daughter-in-law said, and her voice carried a sharp edge of triumph. "And now, so are you. This is my house now." I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. At 69 years old, I had negotiated buyouts for Fortune 500 companies. I had built an investment firm from a single desk and retired with more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. But nothing in my 40 years of business had prepared me for the sheer cruelty of the woman my son had married. "You changed the locks," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. "I called a locksmith the second you went looking for that dog," Melissa answered. The speaker hissed with static again. "Where is Ethan?" "Your son is at a conference in Chicago until tomorrow night," she told me. "He agreed it was time for you to move into an assisted living facility." "You are confused, James. You let the dog out, remember?" "I did not leave the gate open," I told her, and my voice shook. Not from fear, but from a quiet, building rage. "Duke is 14 years old. His hips are bad. He does not run away." "Well, he is gone," the woman snapped. "And if you try to break a window, I will show the police this camera footage of a confused old man trying to damage my property." I stared at the heavy oak door. Margaret had insisted that Duke never spend a single day without that collar. She never explained why. At the time, I thought it was simply another one of her sentimental habits. Standing on that porch, I finally realized she must have had a reason I had never fully understood. My ambitious daughter-in-law did not know that yet. Melissa truly believed that since Ethan paid a single utility bill last month, she held all the cards. I could have called my lawyer right then. I could have called the local police, presented my identification, and forced my way back inside. But the sun was setting, and the temperature was dropping fast. Duke was out there alone. My wife had loved that golden retriever more than anything, and I had promised Margaret I would always keep him safe. Standing on a cold porch arguing with a greedy woman would not bring my dog home. I stepped back from the door, and the loose gravel crunched heavily under my boots. "I am leaving to find my dog," I said directly to the small black lens. "Enjoy the house for tonight, Melissa." I turned away and walked down the long driveway toward my car. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of our quiet suburban neighborhood. A cold wind picked up, biting through my thin jacket, but I barely felt it. I needed to check the nearby streets again, so I pulled my phone from my coat pocket to call the local animal shelter. Then, something caught my eye. A glint of metal rested in the damp grass near the brick mailbox. I bent down and picked it up. It was a thick, braided leather strap attached to a heavy silver buckle, Duke's collar. The thick leather was completely intact, and the metal clasp was perfectly functional. An elderly dog does not just slip out of a heavy collar like this by accident. Someone had deliberately unbuckled it and tossed it into the weeds. My fingers traced the familiar stitching. Margaret had custom-ordered this collar years earlier and warned me more than once never to replace it, no matter how worn it became. Until that moment, I had never questioned why. The inside of the strap contained a hidden, zippered compartment. I pulled the tiny zipper back, but my thumb met nothing but empty fabric. The small pocket was entirely bare. The silver bank deposit key my wife had hidden inside 2 years ago was gone. The empty leather strap hung heavy in my hand. Margaret had tucked that small silver bank key inside the lining exactly 2 years ago, right before her heart finally gave out. Someone had deliberately opened the hidden compartment and removed whatever Margaret had hidden inside. The timing was impossible to ignore, but I forced myself not to jump to conclusions before I had proof. A sick panic settled in my chest. Duke could barely manage the back porch stairs on a damp evening. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I hurried toward my sedan parked at the curb. The engine turned over with a rough growl. Streetlights blurred past the windshield, casting long yellow streaks across the dashboard, while my mind raced through the events of the afternoon. Right before Duke went missing, Melissa had cornered me in the kitchen. She had shoved a clipboard onto the counter, claiming it was a routine authorization form for the neighborhood homeowner association. My mind had been focused on finding the dog's leash, so I had grabbed a pen and signed the bottom line without reading the fine print. My tires squealed slightly, taking the turn onto the main highway. The county animal control facility sat 10 miles outside the city limits, housed in a low cinder-block building that always smelled of bleach and damp fur. The parking lot was mostly empty when I pulled into a spot near the glass entrance doors. Inside, harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, reflecting off the pale linoleum floor. A woman in a blue scrub top stood behind the front reception desk, organizing a stack of pink folders. Her name tag read, Sarah. "Can I help you?" she asked, looking up as the heavy glass door swung shut behind me. "I am looking for a golden retriever," I said, resting both hands flat on the high counter to keep them from shaking. "He is an older dog. Very gray around the muzzle, wearing a blue harness but missing his collar. He would have been brought in a few hours ago." Sarah paused, and her expression softened. The desk chair squeaked as she leaned over to check a computer monitor. "We did have a senior golden brought in just before closing time," she told me, tapping the keyboard. "Let me check the intake log." A sharp bark echoed from the holding area down the hall, followed by a familiar, raspy whine. My breath caught in my throat. "That is him," I said, already stepping toward the heavy metal door separating the lobby from the kennels. "That is Duke." "Sir, you cannot go back there yet," Sarah warned, stepping around the counter. "I need to verify ownership. We always scan for a microchip the minute an animal comes through those doors." I turned back to face her. "Then you know he belongs to my family. He has been chipped since he was a puppy." The shelter manager sighed and crossed her arms. We scanned him. The chip registered to a woman named Margaret Walker. But when we dialed the contact number on file, the automated system said the line was disconnected. The buzzing of the overhead lights suddenly seemed overwhelmingly loud. Margaret's old cell phone number. I had canceled her service a month after the funeral, completely forgetting to update the veterinary registry. The system had worked exactly as designed, but the safety net had failed because of my own oversight. "I can show you photos of him on my phone," I offered, pulling the device from my coat pocket. "My driver license matches the last name on your screen. Margaret was my wife." Sarah held up a hand, her eyes carrying a mix of sympathy and professional caution. "I believe you, Mr. Walker, but I still need to clear up this paperwork. The person who brought him in did not just find him wandering the streets. She reached across the desk and pulled a yellow carbon copy form from a plastic tray. The paper rustled loudly in the quiet lobby. "What do you mean?" I asked, staring at the document. The woman tapped a specific box, checked in black ink. "The intake form marks this as an owner surrender. The person who dropped him off stated the dog was aggressive and requested immediate processing." My jaw tightened so hard my teeth ached. A stray hold would have guaranteed Duke 3 days of safety while the shelter looked for his owner. An owner surrender bypassed that waiting period entirely, making an elderly dog an immediate candidate for euthanasia. "Let me see that paper," I demanded. Sarah slid the yellow sheet across the scratched laminate surface. The printed letters blurred for a fraction of a second before focusing sharply. Right there, on the bottom right corner, was a signature I had seen on dozens of family birthday cards and holiday presents. Melissa Walker. She had not simply opened the gate and chased him away. She had loaded my dog into her car, driven him to this facility, and signed a legal document condemning him to death. All for a house she believed she was inheriting. But Melissa did not know everything. She had found the small silver key inside the collar, likely assuming it opened a safe full of cash or jewelry. She had no idea my late wife had spent months working with a trust attorney to build a financial fortress around our family assets. That key was completely useless without the proper authorization and the corresponding legal documents. A cold realization washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. The clipboard in the kitchen, the paper she had rushed me to sign while I was panicking about the open gate. It was not a homeowner association form. It had to be a limited authorization document, perfectly timed to give her access to something she could not reach on her own. She had manufactured the crisis, stolen the key, and manipulated me into handing over my signature. "I need my dog right now," I told the manager, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "And I need a photocopy of that surrender form." Sarah studied my face for a long moment, taking in the rigid posture and the absolute certainty in my tone. She did not argue. She simply nodded, picked up the yellow sheet, and walked over to the copying machine behind her desk. 10 minutes later, the heavy metal door clicked open. Duke ambled out into the lobby, his tail giving a slow, hesitant wag when he saw me. He smelled like industrial cleaner and fear, but he pressed his gray muzzle firmly against my knee. I knelt down on the hard floor, burying my hands in his thick fur, making a silent promise to the memory of my wife. Melissa wanted to play a game with our family legacy. She wanted to strip away everything I loved. I slipped the photocopy into my coat pocket next to the empty collar. The evidence was already starting to build, and tomorrow morning, she was going to find out exactly what happens when you try to outsmart Margaret Walker. The neon sign outside the cheap motel window buzzed with a low, irritating hum that vibrated right through the thin glass. I sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, watching Duke sleep heavily on the faded floral carpet. The old dog's chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm, though the sharp, chemical scent of the shelter still clung to his golden fur. I smoothed the yellow photocopy of the surrender form flat against the laminate nightstand, placing the empty leather collar right beside it. Melissa had executed her plan with terrifying precision. My son's wife had intentionally left the backyard gate open, sending me into a blind panic over a 14-year-old dog with failing hips. While I was frantically searching the neighborhood, she had unbuckled the collar, unzipped the hidden compartment, and pocketed Margaret's silver safe deposit key. But a physical key was completely useless without authorization. The bank required a signature and proper identification to access the vault. I rubbed my tired eyes, and a cold knot formed in my stomach as the memory from yesterday afternoon finally clicked into place. The clipboard on the kitchen island, Melissa had shoved a piece of paper in front of me, claiming it was an urgent neighborhood association waiver about the damaged fence. I had grabbed a pen and signed the bottom line without putting on my reading glasses, desperate to get back out to the street to find Duke. It had not been a neighborhood waiver. It was a limited authorization form. My fingernails bit into the palms of my hands until they ached. I had negotiated multi-million-dollar corporate mergers for 30 years, and yet I had let a greedy 39-year-old real estate agent trick me in my own kitchen. I needed to get to First Trust Bank before the doors opened. The morning air felt like ice when I loaded Duke into the back seat of my sedan at 8 o'clock. The morning traffic moved at a crawl, and every red light stretched my patience closer to the breaking point. By the time I pulled into the polished concrete parking garage of the downtown bank branch, it was already 9:15. I cracked the car windows for the dog, locked the doors, and walked quickly across the plaza. First Trust Bank always smelled of expensive floor wax and old money. Heavy mahogany desks lined the quiet lobby, and the thick carpets absorbed the sound of my boots as I approached the main counter. "Good morning, Mr. Walker," a familiar voice called out. David Harrison, the branch manager, stepped out from a glass-walled office. He wore a sharp gray suit, and his face carried a practiced, professional smile. We had done business with David for over a decade. "Good morning, David," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level despite the adrenaline rushing through my veins. "I need to access my late wife's safe deposit box, the family trust account." The manager paused, and a flicker of genuine confusion crossed his face. He looked down at the tablet in his hands, then back up at me. "I apologize, James, but did you forget something inside?" My jaw tightened. "What do you mean?" "Your daughter-in-law was just here," David explained, lowering his voice out of respect for the quiet lobby. "She left roughly 20 minutes ago." Melissa presented the silver physical key, her state identification, and a notarized limited authorization form signed by you, explicitly granting her one-time access to Margaret's box. The heavy marble walls of the bank seemed to close in around me. 20 minutes. She had driven straight here the moment the doors unlocked, using the signature she stole from me to bypass the final security measure. "David," I said, leaning slightly against the tall counter to steady myself, "show me the authorization form she used. Right now." "Mr. Walker, is there a problem?" the manager asked, his professional smile fading into a look of corporate concern. "The paperwork was entirely in order. We verified your signature against our files, and the notary stamp was valid. She obtained that signature under false pretenses during a family emergency," I told him, dropping the polite small talk. My voice took on the hard, flat edge I used to reserve for hostile boardroom takeovers. "I am the primary trustee of this estate, and I am instructing you to pull those records." David swallowed hard, nodded once, and hurried back into his office. He returned a moment later with a printed sheet of paper, sliding it across the polished marble. I stared down at the document. It was a standard bank authorization form, but the date and my signature at the bottom were completely authentic. The notary stamp belonged to a woman who worked at Melissa's real estate brokerage. She had likely stamped the blank form days ago, just waiting for the right moment to trick me into signing it. "She got into the vault," I said quietly, handing the paper back. Yes, sir, David confirmed. We escorted her to the secure room. She spent about 10 minutes inside, locked the box, and left. I need a certified copy of that authorization form, I told him, looking the manager directly in the eye. And I need a time-stamped copy of the vault access log showing exactly when she entered and exited the building this morning. David hesitated, adjusting his tie. James, if there is a legal dispute between family members over the trust assets, the bank usually requires a court order to release internal security logs. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the yellow shelter surrender form, placing it gently on the counter. David, my daughter-in-law threw my senior dog into a kill shelter yesterday to steal that bank key. If you force me to call my lawyers and obtain a subpoena, I will also have them investigate whether your branch followed proper protocol regarding power of attorney verification. Or, you can print the access log for the primary account holder right now, and we can keep this entirely civil. The manager looked at the yellow shelter paper, then back at my face. He recognized the absolute certainty in my tone. Give me 2 minutes, Mr. Walker, he said softly, turning back toward his computer. I stood in the quiet lobby, listening to the hum of the air conditioning. Melissa thought she had won. She believed she had outsmarted an old man, secured the family fortune, and cleared the house for a quick sale. But Margaret Walker had never been a simple woman. My wife knew that wealth attracted greed, and she had spent her final months building a fortress that could not be breached with just one silver key. David returned and handed me a sealed manila envelope containing the documents. I thanked him, walked out through the heavy glass doors, and stepped back into the cold morning air. Melissa had opened the first box, but she had absolutely no idea that she had just triggered a trap that was going to cost her everything. I settled into the driver's seat of my sedan and cranked the heater up high. Duke let out a long, shuddering sigh from the back, resting his heavy chin on the fabric armrest. The sealed manila envelope containing the bank security logs sat on the passenger seat, right next to the yellow shelter surrender form. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel tightly. I did not drive back to the house in the suburbs, because my home was currently occupied by a woman who had just declared war on my family. Instead, I put the car in gear and merged onto the highway, heading straight for the downtown business district. The morning sun glared off the windshield, and the steady hum of tires on the pavement gave me a moment to process the sheer audacity of my son's wife. Ethan was still at a conference in Chicago, completely unaware that his marriage was about to become a battleground. Helen Brooks operated her estate planning practice out of a restored brick building near the county courthouse. Margaret had chosen the 63-year-old attorney specifically for her ruthless attention to detail and absolute discretion. The receptionist recognized my face immediately and waved me right through to the corner office. Helen sat behind a massive oak desk, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that smelled strongly of old paper and lemon polish. The lawyer looked up from her computer monitor, adjusting her silver-rimmed glasses. James, the attorney said, her tone professional but laced with genuine surprise. You do not have an appointment this morning, and you look like you spent the night sleeping in your clothes. I stepped into the room and dropped the manila envelope and the yellow carbon copy squarely on the polished wood between us. Melissa moved against the estate today, I told her, keeping my voice steady. She changed my locks yesterday afternoon, dumped Duke at the county kill shelter, and used a forged limited authorization to access Margaret's safe deposit box at First Trust Bank. Helen did not gasp or express any outrage. The experienced lawyer simply picked up the yellow shelter form, scanned the signature at the bottom, and then pulled the bank access log from the envelope. Her dark eyes tracked the printed timestamps carefully, absorbing the timeline of the betrayal. She was in the vault for exactly 10 minutes, I explained, lowering myself into the leather guest chair. My daughter-in-law has the silver physical key she stole from the dog collar, so the manager let her walk right in. I need to know exactly what she took out of that metal box. Helen set the papers down and leaned back in her heavy chair. A faint, knowing smile touched the corners of her mouth, completely transforming her stern expression. She did not take any money, James, the attorney replied quietly, because there is not a single dollar inside that particular steel drawer. I frowned, leaning forward so quickly, the leather chair creaked. Then, what did she just spend 10 minutes looking at? Helen turned to a locked filing cabinet behind her desk, punched in a 5-digit code on the keypad, and pulled out a thick red folder. She laid it flat on the desk, right next to the evidence of Melissa's crimes. Margaret understood that wealth often attracts people willing to look for shortcuts. She designed the trust to withstand exactly those kinds of situations, regardless of who attempted them. the lawyer explained, opening the heavy cover. Your wife designed the trust as a multi-layered security system. That safe deposit box was simply the front door. By forging a document to force her way inside, Melissa just rang the doorbell. The attorney slid a piece of heavy ivory stationery toward me. It was a clean photocopy of a handwritten letter. I recognized Margaret's elegant cursive immediately, and a sudden ache flared behind my ribs at the sight of it. When your daughter-in-law opened the box this morning, this is the first thing she saw, Helen told me, tapping the paper. A personal letter from Margaret, welcoming the reader to the first level of the Walker family trust. The letter clearly states that the estate holds $10 million in liquid assets and real estate properties. I stared at the copied handwriting, tracing the familiar loops of ink with my eyes. Melissa must have thought she hit the jackpot. Oh, I am sure she did. Helen agreed, her voice carrying a dry edge of amusement. But underneath that welcome letter was a thick stack of legal instructions addressed directly to the trust protector. Do you remember who Margaret appointed to that specific role? A retired federal judge from Chicago, I answered, recalling the endless planning meetings 2 years ago. An independent third party who has the absolute power to veto any distribution of funds, completely separate from my authority as the primary trustee. Exactly, the lawyer nodded, resting her hands on the desk. The documents inside the box require the person holding the physical key to contact the trust protector to initiate the formal asset transfer. Melissa now possesses the contact information for the judge, along with a partial copy of the trust bylaws. I shook my head, trying to piece the complex legal strategy together. Why would Margaret give her those instructions? Melissa is going to call that judge today and demand the money. She will probably claim I am medically unfit to manage the estate. She will certainly try, Helen said, closing the red folder with a definitive snap. But the instructions clearly state that the trust protector cannot distribute a single cent until a comprehensive character evaluation is completed. And the very first requirement of that evaluation mandates that the family dog, Duke, must be living comfortably and safely in the primary residence. The quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of the office suddenly sounded incredibly loud. I looked down at the yellow shelter form sitting on the desk, and the brilliance of my late wife's plan finally washed over me. By abandoning the dog yesterday afternoon, the ambitious real estate agent had already failed the very first moral condition. And by rushing to the bank this morning to open the box behind my back, she had officially entered her name as a claimant. Melissa had legally bound herself to a set of rules she did not even know existed until 20 minutes ago. This is only the first layer, the attorney murmured, watching my realization take firm hold. Margaret gave her just enough rope to hang herself. The trust was designed to test every selfish impulse a person possesses. I leaned back in the chair, letting out a breath I felt like I had been holding since yesterday. So what happens now? Now, Helen smiled, adjusting her glasses again. We wait to see what your daughter-in-law does with the information she found. If I know her type, she will not stop at the bank. She believes she has the authority to control the assets, which means she will likely try to liquidate the biggest piece of property she can find before your son gets home. The house, I realized, the word feeling heavy on my tongue. The house, the lawyer confirmed. But just like the safe deposit box, the deed to that property is protected by a wall of paperwork she cannot possibly climb over. The cheap motel room smelled of stale smoke and lemon bleach, a terrible combination that made my eyes water every time the air conditioner kicked on. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress with a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee in my hand, listening to the heavy hum of the ice machine outside the door. Duke rested his large head across my boots, snoring softly. It had been 24 hours since I left Helen Brooks in her downtown law office. The attorney had advised me to stay completely out of sight, warning that any interference right now might stop my daughter-in-law from making her next critical mistake. So, I waited. I watched the local weather report on a small television with a cracked plastic frame, keeping my cell phone right next to me on the laminate nightstand. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the dark screen lit up. The caller ID displayed the main office number for Century Realty, a local brokerage firm. I set my paper coffee cup down and answered on the second ring. James, a familiar voice said, sounding slightly out of breath and incredibly annoyed. It is Barbara Higgins. I leaned back against the cheap wooden headboard, feeling a sudden, sharp surge of adrenaline. Barbara had sold Margaret and me our first starter home 40 years ago. Now, the woman owned the largest independent real estate agency in the county. We attended the same church, and she had stood in the front row at Margaret's funeral. Hello, Barbara, I replied, keeping my tone deliberately relaxed. It has been a long time. Yes. Well, the broker hesitated, and I could hear the faint clicking of a computer keyboard in the background of the call. I am calling you because your daughter-in-law is currently sitting in my main conference room. Melissa just marched in here demanding to list your property on Elm Street for an immediate cash sale. She claims you are moving into an assisted living facility this weekend, and she informed my receptionist that she holds the full legal authority to liquidate the estate. My free hand tightened into a fist. Helen had been absolutely right about the timeline. Melissa believed that finding the bank key and reading that first welcome letter gave her total control over our family wealth. She wanted the house sold and the money deposited before Ethan even returned from his business trip. What did you tell her? I asked, reaching down to stroke Duke behind the ears to calm my own racing pulse. I told her to sit down and drink a glass of water while I pulled the preliminary county records, Barbara said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. James, I just ran the property deed through the public database. Your house does not belong to you, and it certainly does not belong to your son. The title clearly shows that the property was transferred completely into the Walker Family Trust 2 years ago. I know, I told her quietly. Margaret handled the paperwork before she passed away. Well, Melissa certainly does not know, the older woman snapped. She just slapped a forged listing agreement on my glass table. I cannot legally represent this property, and frankly, I do not want any part of this mess. I am going to walk back into that conference room and tell her to leave my office immediately. But I thought you needed a warning. Thank you, Barbara, I said, feeling a genuine wave of gratitude for the loyal friends my wife had cultivated over the years. Please keep a copy of whatever paperwork she brought with her. Will do, the broker promised, before disconnecting the line. The trap was closing rapidly, and my son's wife had no idea she was already caught in the teeth. I immediately dialed Helen Brooks. The attorney picked up on the first ring, listening silently as I relayed the entire conversation with Barbara. When I finished, I fully expected the lawyer to authorize our counterattack. She tried to sell the house today, I told Helen, standing up and pacing across the narrow motel room. We have the shelter surrender form, the bank access logs, and now a fraudulent real estate listing agreement. Let us file the paperwork and freeze her out right now. No, James, the lawyer responded, her voice completely calm through the small phone speaker. We cannot stop her yet. I stopped pacing, staring blindly at the stained floral wallpaper. What are you talking about? She just attempted to steal a piece of real estate. An attempt is not enough to satisfy the legal threshold Margaret established, Helen explained patiently. Your wife built this trust to withstand any challenge in a courtroom. If we strike now, a clever defense attorney could argue that Melissa was simply confused or that she misunderstood the scope of that limited authorization you signed in the kitchen. We need absolute, undeniable proof of malicious intent. How much more proof do we need? I demanded, and a spike of raw frustration hit my chest. She threw Duke away. And that is the emotional core of the betrayal, the attorney agreed. But the legal trigger requires her to officially claim the trust assets under false pretenses. Melissa knows she cannot sell the house now without the actual trust documents. Therefore, her next move will be to demand a formal meeting with me. She will try to force my hand to release the funds. I took a deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. The lawyer was right. If we wanted to destroy her credibility completely, we had to let her stand up in a room full of people and lie directly to our faces. When that meeting happens, Helen continued, the tone of her voice turning cold and sharp, the trust protector will be present. I need Melissa to submit her authorization obtained under false pretenses directly to him. The moment she officially hands over that paper, she crosses the point of no return. That is the evidence threshold. And Ethan? I asked, my throat feeling suddenly very dry at the thought of my son. He gets back from his Chicago conference tonight. Your son needs to attend that meeting, Helen said softly. He needs to see exactly who he married, without any filters or excuses. I will send out the formal legal notices this afternoon. Just keep Duke safe for 2 more days. I ended the call and dropped the phone onto the bed. The old dog whined softly, thumping his heavy tail against the carpet. I knelt down beside him, burying my face in his thick fur. We had the evidence, and the legal trap was completely set. All we had to do now was let Melissa walk through the front door and pull the trigger herself. The heavy rain lashed against the motel window, blurring the bright neon vacancy sign in the parking lot into a smeared streak of red light. I sat at a wobbly wooden desk near the humming air conditioning unit, smoothing out several wrinkled papers under the harsh glare of a cheap desk lamp. The physical evidence of my daughter-in-law and her absolute greed lay spread out across the scratched laminate surface, forming a complete timeline of betrayal. First, the yellow carbon copy from the county animal control facility sat on the left. Then, the printed bank access log from First Trust Bank rested securely in the center. Next to that lay a printed screenshot of my own doorbell camera footage, clearly showing me standing in the cold while the new brass deadbolt reflected the evening streetlights. My cell phone vibrated against the wood, and the cracked screen illuminated with a new email notification. Barbara had kept her promise. The veteran real estate broker had forwarded a digital scan of the exclusive listing agreement Melissa had tried to file that very afternoon. I tapped the screen to open the attached document, zooming in on the final page. Right at the bottom, sitting directly on the authorization line, was a deliberate and messy forgery of my own signature. Melissa had officially crossed the line from emotional manipulation straight into felony fraud, and she had left a brilliant paper trail in her wake. The device buzzed again, but this time, an incoming call replaced the email application. The caller ID displayed my son's name. Ethan had just landed at the regional airport after wrapping up his 3-day corporate conference in Chicago. I picked up the phone and pressed the green button, listening to the chaotic background noise of the baggage claim area. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice crackling slightly over the terrible connection. "Where are you right now? Melissa just picked me up from the terminal, and she claims you had some sort of episode yesterday. She said you left the backyard gate open, lost the dog, and checked yourself into a cheap hotel because you were confused." A sharp ache flared in my chest, but I kept my breathing slow and carefully measured. "That is a very interesting version of the events," I told him quietly. "Drop your luggage at the house, tell your wife you are going to grab a late dinner, and meet me at the roadside diner on 4th Street. Do not ask her any questions about the estate yet." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The heavy, sudden silence spoke volumes about the underlying tension rotting inside their 8-year marriage. "I will be there in 20 minutes, my son finally replied. The diner smelled strongly of old frying grease, harsh bleach, and burnt black coffee. I sat in a back booth upholstered in patched red vinyl, nursing a chipped ceramic mug, while Duke slept quietly under the table. The little brass bell above the glass entrance chimed loudly, cutting through the low murmur of the late-night patrons. Ethan walked in, still wearing his tailored gray travel suit, looking utterly exhausted. He spotted me in the corner, walked over with heavy steps, and slid into the opposite side of the booth. His eyes immediately darted down to the golden retriever resting near my boots, and a visible wave of pure relief washed over his pale face. "You found him," Ethan breathed, reaching a hand under the table to scratch the old dog gently behind the ears. "Thank God." Melissa swore he was gone for good. "I did not find him wandering the streets," I corrected him softly, sliding a thick manila folder across the sticky formica table. "Someone dropped him off." The younger man frowned, pulling the cardboard folder closer to his coffee cup. "What is this?" "Just open it," I instructed, leaning back against the cold vinyl seat. "Read the pages in chronological order." Ethan flipped the heavy cover open, and the yellow shelter surrender form sat right on top. I watched his tired eyes scan the printed text, tracking his gaze as it moved methodically down to the bottom right corner. He froze completely when he recognized the familiar cursive signature, and the ambient clatter of silverware in the diner seemed to fade away into nothing. "This is an owner surrender form," my son whispered, looking up at me with an expression of absolute horror. She checked the box for aggressive behavior. The shelter would have put him down immediately. She needed the silver bank key hidden inside his collar, I explained, keeping my voice perfectly flat despite the anger boiling in my stomach. "And she needed him out of the way permanently before you got home." "Turn the page, Ethan." His hands were visibly trembling when he lifted the yellow sheet to reveal the next document. The bank access logs sat underneath, highlighting the exact 10-minute window when his wife had accessed Margaret's safe deposit box. Next came the printed email from Barbara, boldly displaying the fraudulent real estate listing agreement with my forged signature. Piece by piece, the elaborate illusion of his perfect marriage shattered right there in the diner booth. Melissa had not just panicked during a stressful family emergency. The ambitious woman had executed a calculated, methodical plan to seize control of a $10 million estate, completely bypassing the husband she claimed to love and respect. Ethan closed the folder, pressing both palms flat against the cardboard cover to stop his hands from shaking. He stared blindly at the scratched table for a very long time, and a thick muscle in his jaw twitched violently. "I am going to divorce her," he finally stated, the words sounding hollow and completely devoid of any warmth. I am going back to that house right now, and I am packing her bags tonight. No, you are not, I told him, leaning forward across the table to hold his gaze. If you confront her in the living room tonight, she will spin a massive web of lies, hire a ruthless divorce lawyer, and drag this entire family through years of painful litigation. We need to end this completely, and we need to do it on our own terms. How? My son asked, gripping the sharp edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. Helen Brooks sent out a formal legal notice this afternoon, I explained, taking a slow sip of my bitter coffee. Melissa demanded immediate access to the trust funds, so the attorney scheduled a mandatory reading of the estate documents for tomorrow morning. Your wife thinks she is walking into that boardroom to collect a massive inheritance check. A dark, bitter understanding finally settled into Ethan's eyes, replacing the shock with cold clarity. And what happens when she actually gets there? She is going to proudly hand her forged authorization directly to the trust protector, I said softly. And the moment she places that paper on the conference table, she legally disinherits herself from the Walker family forever. Ethan did not speak for a long time. The young man just sat there in the sticky diner booth, watching Duke rest his chin heavily on my boots, and the ambient noise of the restaurant slowly rushed back into the space between us. A waitress walked by with a pot of coffee, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor, but she took one look at our table and kept right on walking. When my son finally looked up, his eyes held a cold, sharp focus that I had not seen since he was a teenager, defending a bad call on the baseball diamond. What time is the meeting tomorrow? Ethan asked, sliding the thick manila folder back across the table. 10 o'clock in the morning, I replied, carefully tucking the documents back into my leather briefcase. Helen Brooks sent the courier to the house around 4 this afternoon. Melissa should have the official summons sitting on the kitchen counter right now. She does, Ethan confirmed, his voice dropping into a low, controlled register. The 41-year-old executive ran a hand through his short hair, exhaling a long breath. When she picked me up at the airport, she told me your lawyer had requested a mandatory trust reading. She actually sounded excited about it. She said it was proof that you were stepping down and handing over control of the estate. My jaw tightened at the sheer audacity, but I forced my hands to relax their grip on the coffee mug. Did she mention the house or the dog at all? Ethan let out a bitter, hollow laugh. She claimed Duke ran away because you left the side gate open while you were confused, and she said we needed to discuss selling the house to pay for your long-term care facility. I had absolutely no idea she was building this entire narrative while I was sitting in endless marketing seminars in Chicago. I understand, I told him, keeping my tone gentle. Margaret knew that wealth had a way of revealing a person's true nature. That is exactly why she built the trust the way she did. It was never just about protecting the money. It was about protecting the family from anyone who might try to tear it apart from the inside. My son nodded slowly, staring at his untouched coffee. So, what is the plan for tonight? If I go back to that house, I do not know if I can look at her without losing my temper. You have to, I said, leaning forward to make sure he understood the absolute necessity of the performance. If you blow up tonight, she will realize we know everything. She might destroy evidence, call her own lawyer, or try to empty whatever joint accounts you share. You have to go home, act completely exhausted from your flight, and let her believe her plan is working perfectly. Can I stay at the motel with you? Ethan asked, and for a brief second, he sounded like a little boy asking to hide from a thunderstorm. No, I answered firmly. You need to be standing right beside her tomorrow morning in Helen's office. When Melissa hands over that forged authorization, the trust protector needs to witness her husband watching her commit the fraud. That is the only way we sever her from the estate permanently without a lengthy court battle. Ethan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply against his collar. He reached down and patted the dog one last time before sliding out of the red vinyl booth. I will see you at 10, Dad, he said, his voice tightening with resolve. I watched him walk out through the glass doors, his shoulders set in a rigid line against the cold evening air. The bell chimed brightly as the door swung shut, and I finally allowed myself to take a deep, shaky breath. The hardest part of Margaret's plan was not the legal maneuvering. It was watching our only child realize that the woman he married was fundamentally broken. The next morning broke clear and bitterly cold. I parked my sedan in the lot behind Helen Brooks's law office at exactly 9:45. I left Duke resting comfortably in the back seat with the windows cracked and the engine running, promising the old dog I would be back shortly. The heavy mahogany doors of the law firm felt solid and reassuring under my hand. The receptionist nodded silently as I walked in, immediately gesturing toward the large conference room down the hall. When I pushed the glass door open, the room was already tense. Helen Brooks sat at the head of a long, polished oak table, arranging a stack of pristine legal folders. To her right sat a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and a dark suit, Judge Thomas Sterling, the appointed trust protector, and directly across from them sat Ethan and Melissa. My daughter-in-law wore a sharp, tailored navy suit and a practiced expression of deep concern. She looked up as I entered, her hands freezing mid-air for a fraction of a second before she forced a bright smile. "James," Melissa said, standing up quickly and smoothing her skirt. "I am so relieved you are here. We were so worried about you yesterday." I did not answer her. I simply walked to the empty chair beside my son and sat down, placing my worn leather briefcase on the table with a heavy thud. Ethan did not look at his wife. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the polished wood in front of him. "Let us begin," Helen announced, her voice cutting through the artificial warmth in the room like a steel blade. "We are here to formally review the administrative status of the Walker Family Trust." Judge Sterling leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "Mr. and Mrs. Walker," he said, addressing Ethan and Melissa directly. "The creator of this trust, Margaret Walker, established very specific protocols regarding the transfer of assets. I understand that there has been a recent development regarding the primary trustee, James Walker." Melissa nodded eagerly, sliding a manila folder across the table toward the judge. "Yes, Your Honor. Unfortunately, my father-in-law has a condition that has deteriorated rapidly over the last few days. He is exhibiting severe confusion and paranoia. James signed a limited authorization allowing me to assist with administrative matters. I believed I was acting in the family's best interests." The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. Judge Sterling did not reach for the folder. He simply looked at the young woman with a gaze that had likely terrified defense attorneys for 3 decades. "And you are presenting this document today as proof of your legal authority to act on behalf of the trust?" "Yes," Melissa stated clearly, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "I am submitting this authorization to formally request control of the primary assets." The trap sprang shut with a deafening silence. Judge Thomas Sterling held the manila folder suspended in the air above the polished oak table. The silver-haired magistrate did not open it immediately. He looked at Melissa, his expression completely unreadable, and then he let the paper drop. The soft slap of cardboard against wood echoed loudly in the quiet conference room, cutting through the low hum of the central heating system. "Are you absolutely certain this is the document you wish to submit to this legal proceeding?" the judge asked, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Yes, Your Honor," my daughter-in-law replied smoothly, leaning forward in her heavy leather chair. "James signed it for me 2 days ago because his memory is failing. We need to secure the estate before he accidentally gives everything away to a scammer." My hands rested flat on the table, completely steady. I did not need to defend my cognitive abilities because Helen Brooks was already unzipping her dark leather briefcase. The veteran attorney pulled out a thick red folder and laid it right next to her coffee cup. "The Walker Family Trust does not operate on a standard power of attorney," Helen stated, sliding a bound copy of the trust bylaws toward the center of the table. "Margaret Walker structured this estate with conditional inheritance clauses. The safe deposit box you accessed yesterday morning was simply a preliminary test." A small crease appeared between Melissa's carefully groomed eyebrows. The young woman glanced at the thick stack of paper, her confident smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Test," she repeated, her voice losing a bit of its polished warmth. "I secured the trust documents. I have the contact information for the bank officers." "You secured the contact information for the trust protector?" Judge Sterling corrected her, tapping his index finger against the forged authorization she had just provided. "And by submitting this document today, you have officially initiated a claim against the estate. That action triggers the character evaluation." Helen did not give the real estate agent time to process the legal trap. The lawyer reached into the red folder and pulled out the yellow carbon copy from the county animal control facility, placing it directly on top of the forged authorization. "The primary condition of this trust mandates the continued care and protection of the family dog, Duke," Helen explained calmly. "You signed this owner surrender form at exactly 9 o'clock yesterday morning. You deliberately checked the box for aggressive behavior, guaranteeing the animal would be euthanized before your husband returned from Chicago." The color drained completely from Melissa's face, leaving her pale and visibly trembling. Her eyes darted frantically from the yellow paper to the man sitting beside me. "Ethan," she pleaded, her voice rising in sudden desperation. That is a fake. The dog ran away. Your father left the side gate open while he was confused, and I've been looking for Duke all morning. Ethan did not raise his voice. My son simply stared at the woman he had been married to for 8 years, his eyes stripped entirely of the warmth he used to reserve for her. The 41-year-old executive leaned back in his chair, putting physical distance between himself and his wife. I went to the diner with Dad last night, Ethan said quietly, the words dropping like heavy stones onto the polished oak table. I read the bank access logs. I saw the security footage from the doorbell camera showing you locking him out of his own house. Do not lie to me again. Melissa reached for her designer purse, her manicured fingernails scraping harshly against the smooth leather. She realized the emotional manipulation was failing, so the ambitious woman pivoted instantly to a legal defense. You cannot do this, she snapped, glaring at the attorney across the table. The house on Elm Street belongs to Ethan and me. We pay the utility bills. We maintain the property. I am going to call my broker right now and force a partition sale, and neither of you can stop me. Melissa thought the worst was over, but Helen had one final piece of documentary evidence to present. You already tried to force a sale, the attorney interrupted, sliding a printed email across the wood. Barbara Higgins from Century Realty forwarded this to our office yesterday afternoon. You attempted to list a property that was transferred entirely into the Walker Family Trust 2 years ago. The printed screenshot clearly showed the exclusive listing agreement, complete with the forged signature at the bottom of the page. Melissa stared at the paper, her breath catching in her throat as the sheer weight of her own paper trail finally crushed her escape route. Your signature on that listing agreement constitutes real estate fraud, Helen continued relentlessly, and the document you just handed to Judge Sterling constitutes financial fraud. You built a prison out of your own paperwork. Judge Sterling leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the table. The magistrate looked at the forged authorization, the shelter surrender form, and the fraudulent realty email. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by the rapid, shallow breathing of my son's wife. Melissa Walker, the judge announced, his tone carrying the cold, undeniable authority of the law. You have actively violated the core morality clause of this trust, and you have attempted to defraud the estate. As trust protector, I am officially activating the disinheritance protocol. The young woman opened her mouth to argue, but no sound came out. Her hands gripped the armrests of her chair so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Pursuant to the authority granted to the trust protector under Article 7 of the Walker Family Trust, I hereby determine that you have permanently forfeited all present and future beneficiary rights under this trust. You will receive no money. You have no legal right to the Elm Street property. Your status as a beneficiary is permanently revoked, effective immediately. The ambitious real estate agent sat completely frozen, staring at the pile of paper that had just destroyed her entire future. She had walked into the law office expecting to seize a $10 million fortune, and she had just lost everything she valued in less than 15 minutes. Ethan finally turned his head away from his wife. He looked across the wide conference table at me, his face drawn and exhausted, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. The legal battle was completely over, and Margaret's final defense mechanism had worked flawlessly. The heavy silence in the boardroom stretched out, suffocating the air around the polished oak table. Melissa finally blinked, her perfectly manicured hands trembling as they released their death grip on the leather chair. She looked wildly between the judge, the attorney, and her husband, desperately searching for a crack in the solid wall of consequences. Ethan, my daughter-in-law, choked out, her voice cracking under the immense pressure. You cannot let them do this to us. We are a team. I only wanted to secure our future together. My son did not reach out to comfort her. He slowly stood up from the conference table, buttoning his gray suit jacket with precise, deliberate movements. Our future ended yesterday morning, Ethan told her, keeping his tone flat and completely devoid of any affection. You drove to the county shelter and signed a death warrant for a dog I have loved since I was a teenager. Then you spent the evening lying to my face. I am going straight from this office to the county courthouse, Melissa. My attorney has the divorce papers ready to file. The word hung in the air, final and absolute. Tears finally spilled over her eyelashes, ruining her expensive mascara, but the dramatic display of emotion drew absolutely no sympathy from anyone in the room. The young woman realized her marriage was over, so she turned her desperate gaze toward Helen Brooks to save her financial status. Half of that house belongs to me, Melissa insisted, her voice rising to a frantic, shrill pitch. I am legally married to a Walker. You cannot just throw me out on the street without a settlement. Helen adjusted her silver-rimmed glasses, entirely unmoved by the outburst. "You are married to a Walker, but neither you nor your husband own the property on Elm Street. The deed rests securely within the Walker family trust." The veteran lawyer tapped the thick bound bylaws resting on the table. "And as Judge Sterling just ruled, you are now completely severed from this estate. You have no ownership rights, no marital claim, and no legal standing to remain on the premises. The listing agreement you attempted to file yesterday is completely void," Judge Sterling added, gathering his heavy folders. "Furthermore, the trust will immediately begin lawful removal proceedings. Whether you remain another day or choose to leave today is now entirely your decision, but you no longer have any legal right to occupy trust property." Melissa opened her mouth to argue, but the magistrate raised a single finger, stopping her cold. "I strongly advise you to pack your personal belongings quietly, Mrs. Walker," the judge warned, his voice rumbling with authority. "If you cause a scene, or if any trust property is damaged before tomorrow morning, I will instruct the estate to add a trespassing charge to your pending real estate fraud investigation." A sudden, ragged sob tore from Melissa's throat, and she buried her face in her hands. I watched her fall apart, feeling no sense of triumph, only a deep and weary sorrow. Margaret had not designed this grueling legal gauntlet out of cruelty. My late wife had simply understood the toxic nature of greed, knowing that a person driven by money would eventually destroy themselves if given the right opportunity. "You had the entire fortune right in the palm of your hand," I said softly, breaking my silence for the first time since the meeting began. Melissa lowered her hands, her dark makeup smeared across her cheeks. She stared at me, her eyes wide with total confusion. "The trust holds $10 million, I explained, leaning forward slightly so she would hear every single word. "Margaret allocated half of that money directly to Ethan, and by extension, to you. All you had to do was absolutely nothing. If you had just let me live peacefully in my own home, if you had just let my old dog sleep on the living room rug, the inheritance would have transferred smoothly after I passed away." The realization hit her like a physical blow to the chest. Her eyes widened even further, tracking the yellow shelter surrender form still sitting on the center of the conference table. "Duke was the ultimate moral test," Helen clarified, her tone holding a note of quiet respect for Margaret's genius. "The animal care clause controlled the entire distribution matrix. By throwing a helpless senior dog out into the cold to speed up your payday, you triggered the one specific condition that permanently locked the vault. Your own selfishness cost you $5 million today." My daughter-in-law sat perfectly still, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her fatal mistake. She had traded a guaranteed lifetime of wealth for a stolen silver key that opened absolutely nothing. Ethan did not wait for her to speak again. He picked up his leather briefcase, walked around the large wooden table, and rested a heavy hand on my shoulder for a brief second. Then, my son turned and walked out of the glass boardroom doors without looking back. I stood up, pushing my heavy chair in slowly. The joints in my knees ached, providing a sharp reminder of my 69 years, but my chest felt incredibly light for the first time in weeks. I gathered my coat from the back of the chair and turned to face the attorney. "Thank you, Helen," I told the lawyer. "Margaret would be very pleased with how you handled this." "Your wife was a brilliant strategist, James," the attorney smiled, organizing her final files. "Go get your dog. The house belongs to you again." I walked out of the law firm and stepped into the crisp morning air. The heavy gray clouds had finally parted, allowing the bright morning sun to warm the concrete pavement. Duke was waiting patiently in the back seat of my sedan, his tail thumping rhythmically against the upholstery when I opened the driver door. We had spent the last 2 nights hiding in a cheap motel, waiting for the legal trap to snap shut. Now, the fraudulent brass locks on the Elm Street house meant absolutely nothing. I started the engine, put the car in gear, and steered us toward the highway. It was time to go home. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long, golden shadows across the familiar streets of our suburban neighborhood. The tires of my sedan crunched loudly over the loose gravel of the Elm Street driveway, and I brought the heavy car to a gentle stop. I cut the engine and let out a slow breath, listening to the metallic ticking of the cooling radiator. Duke shifted his weight in the back seat, his tail thumping a steady rhythm against the leather upholstery. The old dog recognized the scent of the pine trees bordering our front lawn through the cracked window. We had spent 3 days living in a cheap, harsh-smelling motel room, waiting for the legal trap to close. Now, we were finally home. A silver luxury vehicle sat parked haphazardly near the front porch, its rear trunk yawning wide open. Melissa walked out of the heavy oak front door, dragging two massive designer suitcases behind her. The hard plastic wheels scraped violently against the concrete walkway, echoing through the quiet neighborhood. My son's wife did not look like a polished, confident real estate broker anymore. Her expensive navy suit looked rumpled, her hair was tied back in a messy knot, and her posture carried the undeniable, crushing weight of absolute defeat. She shoved the heavy bags into the back of her vehicle, her hands moving with frantic, jerky motions. I stayed sitting in the driver's seat, simply watching the scene unfold through the clear windshield. Melissa slammed the trunk shut, the loud metallic thud making Duke lift his head in curiosity. For a brief, terrifying second, the young woman locked eyes with me through the glass. I fully expected a sudden scream of anger, or perhaps a final, desperate plea for financial mercy. But she offered absolutely nothing. She simply dropped her gaze, turned her face away, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the loud engine. She backed down the driveway and drove away, disappearing around the corner without saying a single word. The silence she left behind felt incredibly peaceful. Ethan stood alone on the top step of the wooden porch, watching the red taillights of his wife's car fade into the distance. His gray suit jacket hung loosely from his shoulders, and the 41-year-old executive looked like he had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. I opened my car door, stepping out into the crisp autumn air, and let the golden retriever out of the back. Duke ambled slowly across the green grass, sniffing the familiar rose bushes, before heading straight for the wooden steps to greet my son. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice cracking painfully as he reached down to bury his hands in the dog's thick fur. "I am so sorry. I should have seen exactly what she was doing behind your back. I should have protected you and Duke." I walked up the concrete steps and placed a hand firmly on my son's shoulder. The rough wool of his jacket felt cold under my fingers, holding the chill of the afternoon breeze. "You trusted the woman you married?" I told him quietly, keeping my gaze steady on his exhausted face. "There is absolutely no shame in believing the best about someone you love. The only real tragedy would have been refusing to see the ugly truth once it was placed directly in front of you." We walked inside the house together, and the quiet familiarity of the living room wrapped around me like a warm, heavy blanket. The faint scent of Margaret's favorite lavender furniture polish still lingered in the air. Duke immediately crossed the hardwood floor and curled up on his favorite braided rug near the stone fireplace, letting out a deep, shuddering sigh of absolute contentment. The forged brass locks on the front door would be replaced by a professional tomorrow morning. Today, we simply needed to breathe. I walked over to the mahogany coffee table, unlatched my worn leather briefcase, and pulled out a plain white envelope. Helen Brooks had handed this specific envelope to me in the law firm parking lot, right after the trust meeting concluded. The veteran attorney had promised that Margaret had left one final set of written instructions, meant to be opened only after the legal battle was entirely finished and the threat was removed. I broke the thick wax seal with my thumb and pulled out a single sheet of heavy ivory stationery, along with a faded Polaroid photograph. Ethan stepped closer, his red eyes focusing intently on the familiar handwriting. "My dearest James," the elegant cursive began, "if you are reading this letter together with our son, then the security measures I built worked exactly as designed. Ethan is finally free from a woman who only loved our bank accounts. I never built this trust around any one person. I built it around a simple truth. Greed always reveals itself when given enough opportunity. Anyone who chose selfishness over compassion would eventually fail the moral character test, because true greed cannot help but expose itself when presented with a golden opportunity." She thought she was hunting a fortune, but she was simply walking into a cage. The letter continued, outlining the final, beautiful phase of my wife's grand strategy. "Now that the primary estate is entirely secure, I have instructed Judge Sterling to release $2 million from the investment portfolio. That money will establish a permanent charitable foundation to fund the county animal shelter. We are going to ensure that no senior dog in this city is ever abandoned, turned away, or euthanized for convenience ever again. Duke saved our family today, so we are going to save his friends tomorrow." I picked up the small Polaroid photograph resting underneath the ivory paper. It was a picture taken 8 years ago, on the exact day we brought Duke home from a local rescue facility. Margaret was smiling brightly, holding the clumsy golden retriever puppy in her arms, looking directly into the camera lens with a fierce, protective joy. A warm tear slipped down my weathered cheek, catching in the collar of my shirt, but I did not bother to wipe it away. Ethan wrapped his arms around my shoulders, pulling me into a tight, grounding embrace that carried years of unspoken healing and deep regret. We stood there in the quiet living room, surrounded by the undeniable strength of a woman who had fiercely fought for her family from beyond the grave. Duke snored softly by the brick fireplace, completely safe and profoundly loved. The long, exhausting war was finally over, and we were whole again. When you stand in the quiet comfort of your own living room 1 year later, watching the dust finally settle on a shattered family dynamic, the reality of what just happened begins to take root in your heart. You realize that you cannot buy loyalty, and you certainly cannot inherit a moral compass. The story of the Walker family is not just a dramatic tale about a hidden safe deposit key or a cleverly designed legal trust. It is a profound reflection on the absolute destructive power of greed and the enduring strength of a woman's foresight. Margaret Walker understood a fundamental truth about human nature that we often try to ignore when it comes to our own relatives. She knew that sudden wealth acts as a magnifying glass. It does not necessarily change who a person is. It simply reveals exactly what they have always been. As you navigate the complex relationships within your own family, especially when new members marry into your carefully built life, you must remember that true character is never demonstrated in how someone handles a $10 million windfall. Character is proven in how they treat the most vulnerable members of your household. It is revealed in the way they look at an elderly father who is losing his footing, or how they treat a faithful, aging dog who can no longer climb the porch stairs. When you see someone treating an innocent creature as a disposable inconvenience, you are seeing their absolute truth. You must never look away from that truth, no matter how much it hurts to accept it. You spend decades of your life building a home, accumulating assets, and trying to leave a secure legacy for your children. But the greatest protection you can ever offer your family is not a massive bank account. It is the wisdom to establish firm boundaries and the courage to demand basic human decency. You have the right to protect your peace. You have the right to ensure that the fruits of your lifelong labor do not fall into the hands of someone who would sell out your dignity for a quick payout. A mother's intuition rarely misses the mark. And when you combine that deep intuition with strategic, unshakable boundaries, you create a fortress that no amount of selfish ambition can breach. You must remember that walking away from toxic greed is not a defeat. It is the ultimate victory. When you set conditions that require kindness and patience, the people who are only pretending to love you will eventually exhaust themselves. They will always walk themselves right into the very traps their own selfishness created. And when they finally pack their bags and drive away from the life you built, you do not have to feel guilty for letting the door close behind them. You are simply allowing the trash to take itself out. Have you ever witnessed a moment where the promise of money completely unmasked someone you thought you knew? How did you find the strength to protect your family's legacy and your own peace of mind when someone's greedy nature was finally revealed? Share your experiences in the comments below, because your story might be exactly what another woman needs to hear today.